Late night at the Ledge, Wednesday night. Definitely appreciate you guys showing up as you always do. I know I say that a lot, but I mean that. And I truly appreciate you guys showing up, trying to figure out this new system I got. Hopefully we're streaming live and you can hear me okay. Every now and then, so I can check the chat now. So if you can leave me a thumbs up or just talk to me in the chat and tell me you're here, that'd be fine. Anyway, Wednesday night, late night at the Ledge. Appreciate you showing up. As always, I want to give some thank yous and some shout outs. I want to give a huge thank you to my wife, Conway, for being patient with me and walking with me through this whole process. We ran for office together. You don't ever hear me say I ran for office. You hear me say we ran for office because it was definitely a team effort, and it continues to be a team effort. So I want to give a huge shout out to my wife, Nicole Conway. You can find her on Instagram as well as LinkedIn. She's a mental health advocate working with NAMI. And I also want to give a shout out to all my colleagues, friends, family on LinkedIn. Thank you for always supporting me. Thank you for sharing the post. Thank you for just kind of talking about, some of the things that I talk about and that resonates with you. So I appreciate it. Shout out to Black Excellence, Black History Month. Excuse me. And IG, Instagram, shout out to all my Instagram folks. I appreciate y'all. I'm really not that active on social media, but I try to be consistent. So every Wednesday night, you're going to get this. And I'll probably push it out on Instagram. Sometimes I'm on Facebook, but mostly it's LinkedIn and Instagram. So I appreciate y'all supporting that. imac.org, as always, EYMAC.org. Equally Yoked is it's a research firm that my wife and I own, and we specifically work with organizations to help them target their audience with messaging and making sure that that the polling and the surveying that we do really helps build out their messaging. So if you go to imac.org, you will also see that we are doing some work with Reform. Shout out to Reform, Give Life Back campaign. Just amazing work around parole and probation, making sure folks don't end up doing a life sentence after they've done their sentence. And along with that, shout out to Alliance for Safety and Justice, particularly Time Done. It's always important for people who have experienced the sting of the cage to find other folks who have also felt that sting, and together we build power. So shout out to Alliance Safety and Justice and Time Done. Also, all right, so that's it. I'm talking about my shout outs and all that. So let's get to it. Last week we talked about voting a conviction. I talked about the reasons why we should be looking at, making sure that folks with convictions are able to vote and freeing up the vote for people that, don't even have a conviction, or folks that may have been arrested and for whatever reason, we should have universal access to voting, is what the last episode was about. This episode, as y'all may have seen, I've titled it Voter Fraud is a Myth. And the reason why I'm talking about voter fraud is I see the hesitancy in people exercising their civic duty because of this fear, and this fear of being penalized for being what basically makes us an American, which is the right to vote in all elections. The Brennan Center, they issued a report on the same issue. It's called The Truth About Voter Fraud. There's a link in the description. And they found that most of these reported cases, they're either clerical errors or just bad data matching practices. And according to a report, they found that 0.0004% and 0.0009% was the ratio to allowable votes to what they would consider voter fraud. So what that means, 300 million votes over a series of elections, there's only been 84 founded convictions. 84, 86, maybe 86, I think. So voter fraud is a myth, but it's a myth that has perpetuated, and it's working. Like across the country, there have been legislation passed that is now really impacting people's access to voting. And so tonight we're going to talk about voting. We're going to talk about ways to organize around voting. We're going to talk about ways to register people to vote. But most importantly, we're going to talk about where voting suppression came from. And we're going to talk about the 5 top voter suppression tactics. But before I get into that, when I first started this work back in 2016, I can remember it like it was yesterday. It was my first time ever being invited to speak at a symposium. It was about dismantling mass incarceration, and it was at Ole Miss. And part of the tour, or part of the visit, was a tour at Parchman. Now, if you're not familiar with Parchman, Parchman is the Mississippi Department of Corrections. Now, in Texas, there are prisons all over the state. Well, in Mississippi, the prison is basically a little city. Now, I had never experienced that, where there were houses on the compound, there were schools. Well, no, the school bus came and picked the kids up out in front of the prison, but they lived, the parents that worked on the prison lived on the prison ground. So it was a crazy experience for me. But the thing that stood out to me the most was when you walk into the visiting center, right? A prison has a visiting center. They actually have tours. When you walk into the visiting center, there's an 8x10 picture on the wall of a little 10-year-old black kid who's in chains. And the woman that was doing the tour, I asked her, I said, "How old is he?" And she said, "Well, he's 10. I said, "He was locked up?" "Well, yes, because back then they did that." And I was about to take a picture of it, and she said, "No, you can't take a picture of it because they don't want that to be out, but we still post it." And she was a black woman. And I don't know, it resonated with me in a way, because I later found out that Fannie Lou Hamer had been locked up there. There's a link to her in a description about why she was arrested and beaten in Winona, Mississippi. And I thought about Fannie Lou Hamer, and I thought about her putting her life on the line just to register people to vote, just to make sure people had access to the very thing that they had been denied because they had been freed. We're going to talk about slave codes. We're going to talk about Jim Crow. We're going to talk about why this voter fraud myth is a continuum of voter suppression tactics that came out of the enslaved being freed. Post-Reconstruction, politics looked completely different when you had this body of folks now suddenly able to vote. And what's interesting is that we often think about Jim Crow as a Southern institution. We often think about slavery as a Southern institution. But when I moved to New Jersey, in Texas, they call them county commissioners. Well, in New Jersey, up until last year, they were called freeholders. Now, freeholders is a term that meant free men who were holders of land. Well, we know who that was. Well, so freeholders is also an extension of the voting access. Like, people who were only able to vote were folks who held land, or their grandfathers were able to vote prior to the 15th Amendment. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about voter suppression tactics. You know, at the top of the list is gerrymandering. You can look across the country and see how strategically gerrymandering has been used to undercut power in communities that have been historically disenfranchised, poor communities. As a matter of fact, just for point of history, that the original voter suppression pushback was done by poor white men that didn't own land. So what that means is that historically, there has always been an effort to restrict the access to poor people, people of color, and definitely anyone that may have immigrated here. Those folks have always been systemically denied access. And at some point, we even codified that. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. The second way is denying folks who have been convicted of a felony the right to vote. And you have to understand that that's also a tie-in to slavery. It's a tie-in to convict leasing. It's a tie-in to Jim Crow and slave codes. If you were able to give someone a civil death, if you will, via a felony conviction, then that removed their standing as a citizen and their ability to vote. Well, if you create these laws based upon meandering, malingering, we were released without having access to housing, without having access to jobs. And then they would come and round us up and put us back on the same farms that we were released from via the sheriff. So there's always been a connection to denying of freedom physically in a cage and tying that to denial of freedom as an American exercising participatory democracy. Thirdly, voter ID requirements and intimidation. Now, I'm from Texas, so I talk about Texas. Texas is one of those places where there are stringent ID laws, where people aren't showing up to the polls because they don't have proper ID. If your ID is expired, my driver's license, my Texas driver's license expired, you don't really understand how the average person doesn't go and update their license and their ID regularly, and the lawmakers know this. They know that the first thing on our mind isn't going to go stand in line at the DMV or in Texas, the EPS, right? So, of course, making stringent ID requirement laws is going to make sure you restrict access. Intimidation, poll watchers, these having folks stand around and see if you are executing your vote properly. That's intimidation. Now, back in the day, they used to have actual people there that would intimidate Black people and recently freed folks, all the way up until 1940, there was a significant reduction in the amount of people who were voting that were Black. I want to say it was like 3% up to 1940 as a result of poll watching and these supposed voter fraud tactics. Undermining election security and disinformation. We spent the last 3 or 4 years talking about it. I've included some links in there to talk about specifically how that has been used as a suppression tactic. Polling place closures and roll purges. Those are both bureaucratic ways to remove people from access to voting that are very silent and you really don't know, particularly if you're someone that hasn't historically voted. You're not gonna know if you've been purged from the voter rolls until you try to go and vote, which by that point is too late, which I will get into on the other part of this video. I talked about the reason why polling places were so important, and couple of videos back. So if you want to, I'll probably post a link or one of those chapters that you can click right here. So you can go and talk about why polling places. But basically, when you reduce the access to polling places to go and vote, you can always expect there to be a specific narrative driven about that part of the city, right? So if you reduce the places to poll, you can say, well, Black folks don't vote. If you take polling places off the college campuses, well, you know, kids don't vote. Those college kids don't vote. So it supports the narrative, even though it's bureaucratically implemented or constructs, if you will, that drive a narrative that continues to allow them to, and I say them, I'm talking about anybody that is restricting access to the polls, just so we're clear. So polling closures and poll purges. Now, the reason why I say voter fraud is a myth, I put a link there, is because a myth is something that, you know, is based in some form of fact, but is mostly fiction. And in fact, there have been cases of voter fraud, 86 over, you know, the last couple of elections where there have been 86 convicted fraud cases. So there are some instances, but widespread voter fraud is a myth for your research. But why? Well, some would argue that the reason why voter suppression tactics even came into existence is a result of slavery ending. You know, most of the folks who had been denied access were also in places where they made up a large bulk of the population. And that's why, you know, 3/5 of a man was important, because if you were 3/5 of a man, then even if you had the vote, you still weren't, it took 4 or 5 of you to equal a vote. My math is off, but you understand what I'm saying. On June 25th, 2013, Section 5, the United States Supreme Court held that it is unconstitutional to use the coverage formula in Section 4B. Now, Section 4B of the voting rights was used to determine which jurisdictions are subject to the preclearance requirement of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, Shelby County versus Holder. Now, the Supreme Court did not rule on the constitutionality of Section 5 itself, but the effect of the Shelby County decision is that the jurisdiction identified by the coverage formula in Section 4B no longer needed to seek preclearance for the new voting changes unless they're covered by a separate court order entered under Section 3C of the Voting Rights. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is the reason why the 15th Amendment was implemented was to remove intimidation tactics. It was to remove voter suppression tactics. It was to make sure that you weren't able to use the Ku Klux Klan as a means of intimidating people not to go to the polls. Well, in 2013, we gutted the Voting Rights Act. And we said that, you know, it's no longer necessary for us to consider that coverage formula. Well, what that tells me is it's time to organize. And I call this Voting Rights 101 because we really got to go back to the basics and really explain to people why their voting rights are so important. And we got to start organizing. Now, y'all hear me talking about system impacted folks, and I'm still talking about system impacted folks, but I want to broaden it. I want to talk about the youth. I want to talk about voting age and millennials. But I want to talk about system impacted voting age and millennials. We got to figure out how to organize them. The youth was the margin that took us this side of fascism. The youth will be the determining factor on whether we have progressives in office or not. And that means we have to connect with the youth in a way that we haven't. And one of the ways we are able to connect with the youth is by organizing around issues. Now, I know that's hard at the state level and it's hard at the local level, but at the federal level, it's easy. Student debt. For former incarcerated folks, it could be healthcare, it could be housing. There are ways for us to organize around issues, but we got to get smart because COVID, as y'all know, we can't organize the same. We're not going door to door. We're not holding big organizing events. We're not showing up, to concerts, hopefully without mask on. So that means we gotta, what does organizing in a digital age mean? Well, it might mean us using dating apps. It might mean us going on dating apps and putting a profile picture up of, are you registered to vote? If not, come talk to me. It might mean, we create Instagram profiles specifically to target people to help them see if they are registered to vote. We got to figure out how to use what we have access to. If we can slide to somebody's DM, let's slide in their DM with some information and some passion about why we are asking them about their voting standing or whether or not they are registered to vote and when the last time they have voted. I think we have to be registering system impacted votes. Now, as we are going into inboxes and as we are organizing these people and as we are figuring out how to get them activated, we got to make sure the ones who aren't registered get registered. Now, I believe we should be showing up on high school and college campuses, registering people to vote. I believe we should be training high school and college kids to be deputy registrars. I think we should be going in places where people aren't going to register people to vote. That means we got to be showing up at football games. We got to be showing up at basketball games. We got to be showing up wherever kids are going to go hang out after the games. If that's McDonald's, I know here in North, it's McDonald's, right? And wherever it is, we can be. Their family members, their mothers, their fathers. That means PTA meetings. We got to be showing up to school board meetings. We got to be showing up. And the reason why I'm saying this is because those places are where people care. And those are the places where most politicians and most voting right advocacy groups aren't showing up. We got to show up where other folks aren't showing up. We got to show up in jails, prisons, and detention centers. In states and localities where people can vote while incarcerated, we should be launching registration campaigns. Formerly incarcerated folks, as you hear me say over and over, is a deeply untapped reservoir of power that we have to begin to tap into. Now, once we have folks organized and registered, primary elections. This is primary season. We got to get people to the primaries. We got to get people in office who are progressive, people in office who are going to hear us. We've done everything that they said they needed in order to pass these bills, and they still haven't done it. So that means we have to hold them accountable democratically. Now, this goes into the policy end of it and the advocacy end of it, and I'm almost done. I've been talking for a bit, and I'm almost done. So going back to how to pass a bill, we understand the power of committees. That and the Speaker of the House are usually the ones who assign folks to committees and determine who the committee chairs are. So what does that mean? Well, committees are the best way for people to get reelected. That means they're first on our target list. We should be targeting committee chairs. If they're not going to be amenable to our request, then they should be held accountable and be held to the same standard that they're trying to hold us to. Committee chairs, committee members, and between 2% and 4% of the bills that are introduced are the ones that are passed. So we have a better shot killing something than we do passing something. We gotta target committees. If we're not targeting committees and committee members, we're holding a candle in the wind, in my opinion. And just for, I should have said this at the top, I apologize. When I do these videos, I'm doing these videos in my own capacity. I'm not getting paid. I just believe that people deserve to have access to information. I know that when I was organizing, people didn't really explain things to me in a way that I understood them, nor did they make it come home in the sense that, my expertise was my lived experience. So that's why I'm doing this. All right. Every Wednesday night, I appreciate y'all. I was a little disjointed. I apologize. I'll leave some notes in the chat. If y'all have any questions, it doesn't look like there was any chat. So I appreciate y'all for showing up. If you showed up, I can't tell if you're watching or not, but thank you so much. And LewisConwayJr.com, buildingpower.org, justiceimpacted.info. And I appreciate y'all every week. I do it for y'all. And together we can win. And that's what building power is to win. All right. You guys have a good one. Be phenomenal or be forgotten. Y'all be good.